Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 24th Annual Tenenbaum Family Lectureship, sponsored by the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies here at Emory University. I am Eric Goldstein, the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute, and it's my pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. As most of you know, the Tam Institute is one of the leading research and teaching institutions for Jewish studies in the American South, bringing together scholars and students from a number of different departments and programs. The Institute offers an undergraduate major and minor, and also provides support for doctoral level work in Jewish studies. Each year, through programs like the Tenenbaum Lecture, we bring a variety of distinguished visiting scholars to campus to share their knowledge with faculty, students, and the broader community. And we are thrilled to have Dr. David Fishman of the Jewish Theological Seminary with us tonight to speak on the book Smugglers of the Vilna Ghetto. I know we are all in for a very stimulating and meaningful evening. Like all of you, the Tam Institute has been working very hard to meet the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year. Our faculty and students have been working, studying, and researching remotely. Our classes have been mainly online, and our conferences, lectures, and symposia have also shifted to a virtual format. While these changes have been difficult, they have also opened up some new perspectives and opportunities. In the area of public scholarship especially, we have found that we have been able to reach many people with online programs who do not live in Atlanta and would otherwise not be able to participate in and benefit from our offerings. For example, I'm thrilled to announce that this evening over 800 people registered for this lecture in advance. And I see there are already something about 550 in the room. Although of course there's an attrition rate on Zoom, this is a meaningful impact by any standard. The Tenenbaum Family Lecture Series salutes the family of the late Meyer Tenenbaum of Savannah, Georgia. A native of Poland, Meyer Tenenbaum arrived in the United States at the age of 13, knowing no English, and 10 years later, in 1931, he graduated from Emory College, and the following year earned a degree from the Emory University School of Law. He went on to head the Chatham Steel Corporation, now a major steel service center with headquarters in Savannah. The lectureship was established in 1997 by Meyer's son, Samuel Tenenbaum, and honors the entire Tenenbaum family for its ethos of citizenship and public service. And I would like to especially welcome and thank Sam and Inez Tenenbaum and all of the members of the Tenenbaum family who are in the audience tonight. Thank you so much for your support. I want to take a minute to thank two of our Tam Institute staff members, our new executive director, Paul Entis, and our communications coordinator, Danielle Petrone, for all of their hard work on tonight's program. And I also want to thank the chair of this year's Tenenbaum Committee, Professor Miriam Udell, and also our committee member, Professor Ofra Yeglin, for providing leadership for the Tenenbaum events. And finally, many thanks to the Emory College of Arts and Sciences for its continued support of our program. And with that, I am pleased to introduce the Dean of Emory College, Michael Elliott, to offer a welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And I really do just want to welcome you to this critical event. And thank you for spending some time getting to know Emory College and getting to know the Tam Institute and what we do here. It is truly thrilling to see, I see 575, my participant counter right now, the bottom of my Zoom screen. Normally, this would be a time where I'd say how wonderful it is to have you on campus. And in a way, I'd like to think of this Zoom screen as an extension of our campus tonight. Of course, we would love to all be back together in a crowded Ackerman Hall in the Carlos Museum, but it's so great to have you together, engaging in the work of the university. And one of the things I admire so much about the Tam Institute is the way that it brings our scholarly mission, our teaching and research mission, to a broad public beyond the academy. Our lecturer tonight, David Fishman, with his work on the book Smugglers of the Vilna Ghetto, is a prime example of that work. And I want to thank the Tenenbaum family for making this lecture and this lecture series possible. Without your support, events like this would simply not exist. And so thank you to the Tenenbaums, And thank you again to all of you for joining us. And now I'd just like to introduce somebody else I also wanted to thank for helping to make this possible, my colleague Miriam Udell, who holds an appointment in both the Department of German Studies and in the TAM Institute, who will introduce more formally tonight's lecturer.
Thank you so much, Dean Elliott. David E. Fishman is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, teaching courses in modern Jewish history. He was educated at Yeshiva University and at Harvard University. He also serves as director of Project Judaica, JTS's program in the former Soviet Union. He directs its Jewish Archival Survey, which publishes guides to Jewish archival materials in the FSU. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of Eastern European Jewry. His several monographs include Russia's First Modern Jews with New York University Press, The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture in 2005. Dr. Fishman is co-editor of From Mesopotamia to Modernity, 10 Introductions to Jewish History and Literature, and he edited a volume of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's Yiddish writings, Droshes und Ksovim. His most recent book is what he's going to be sharing with us tonight, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, published in 2017 and winner of a National Jewish Book Award. The volume has been hailed as monuments men for book lovers and as first-rate scholarship that pulses with the beat of a most human heart. And I have to concur with these assessments. I am now in the middle of my second reading of the book. And the reason for that is that normally when I read a book that pertains to my scholarly interests, I open up a computer file and I take reading notes. And when I first read The Book Smugglers, I noticed that I didn't want to stop to put anything into the notes. I just wanted to keep reading and turning page after page. The narrative was that propulsive. So now I'm going back and enjoying a second reading of figuring out how Professor Fishman created that vitality on the page. For 15 years, he was editor-in-chief of the Yivo Blätter, the Yiddish language scholarly journal of the Yivo Institute for Jewish Research. He is a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and serves on the editorial boards of Jewish Social Studies and Polin, key periodicals in our field. He comes by these scholarly relationships honestly. He is a living link to previous generations of Yiddish scholarship, and together with his brilliant wife, Elisa Ben-Porad, he is extending those scholarly relationships into the future. As a couple, they literally provide an address for Yiddish. Pre-pandemic, their home was the address, and there was tea and cookies and Yiddish reading at an advanced level every Sunday night. The reading continues over Zoom, and it now attracts a following that stretches from the West Coast of the United States to Europe and Japan. A native New Yorker, Professor Fishman has taught at Brandeis University, Bar Ilan University, Russian State University in Moscow, and Yeshiva University's Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. He has been a Fulbright Scholar in Lithuania, a fellow at the Hebrew University's Institute for Advanced Studies, and the University of Pennsylvania's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. And we are so very fortunate, even if it was a year in the making and we had to be somewhat patient, to have him with us tonight on our virtual campus to share with us about the book smugglers of the Vilna Ghetto. Welcome to Emory, Professor Fishman.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Dean Elliott, and thank you, Professor Goldstein. It's a real honor, even though I'm not physically at Emory, it's an honor to be with you and to participate in your programs. And I still feel like I am owed a visit, or I owe you a visit, but this is a special pleasure. The story I'm going to tell you, based on my book, my recent book, The Book Smugglers, is a great story of heroism of a different type. Even though it takes place in the period of the Holocaust, it is fundamentally a very inspiring story, a very uplifting story. It's about, in a nutshell, the rescue of books, manuscripts, art, historical documents from the Nazis at the hands of ghetto inmates. Now, for most of this talk, I'm going to be showing you slides. I'm going to be showing you images. So you will only see me now, and I believe you'll see me, of course, at the end for Q&A, but I think the images will bring this to life as much as my narrative will. Before I start with all the slides, let me start with an autobiographical note. How did I come to this topic in this book? I'll tell you, it's accompanied me in the back of my mind for more than 30 years. In 1989, so that's what, 32 years ago, I was a fresh PhD, just out of graduate school, just moved to New York. And I got a call from the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research here in New York, which is an institute to study the Jews of Eastern Europe and Yiddish culture. And they had just found out that there was an enormous trove of Jewish books and papers in what had been a church in Vilnius, Lithuania. And this was in the waning years of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was collapsing. I and the colleagues, the director, the chief archivist, got on a plane to examine that trove, discovered, again, unexpectedly, in what was clearly a church. And what we found was extraordinary and amazing, sort of a panoply of every type of Jewish type of photograph, document, manuscript, book. And of course, that experience, which was very powerful for me, led me to investigate, well, how did this happen? How did this stuff end up here now in 1989? And I wrote an essay. I didn't think I'd write a book. I worked on many other topics, very different topics. But eventually I came around as I collected material and said, yes, a book can be written. And this is the book in a nutshell that I wrote. Yes, the book has appeared in many languages, including most recently in Israel in Hebrew. The story of this that I'm going to tell you takes place in Vilna. Today it is Vilnius, the capital of independent Lithuania. But then before World War II, Vilna belonged to Poland. It was not the largest Jewish community in Poland before the war. Even the second, it was the fourth largest Jewish community in Poland before the war, after Warsaw, the capital, and Lodz, another important city, Lvov, today Lviv. It was number 4, but it had a very special intellectual and one might say spiritual legacy. Vilna was known by Jews as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, Jerusalem de Lita. It had a very strong tradition of scholarship, of learning, of reading, and of study. The father of that tradition was this rabbi, Rabbi Elijah, the Vilna Gaon in the 18th century, who really put study of the Bible and of other holy books in the Jewish tradition above everything else. More important than prayer, even for him, more important than good deeds. And he really introduced a kind of intellectualist tradition that was characteristic of Lithuanian Jews that were also known as Litvaks. And thanks to that tradition, Vilna became a great center of Jewish printing. On the left, you see an edition, a volume of the Talmud in its Vilna edition. That lower word in red is the name of the city, Vilna. And the classical edition of the Talmud in the 19th century and also used for most of the 20th century was the Vilna edition, as it was called, the Vilna Shas. In the 20th century, this city is a great center of Yiddish publishing. You can see here many different Yiddish newspapers and periodicals. At its peak, there were 5 daily Yiddish newspapers in Vilna. This is a city that had no more than 70,000 Jews, though I should add that those 70,000 Jews were about a third of the city's population, so it's proportionately a very Jewish city. But 70,000 is not an enormous number. And the only way you can have 5 daily Yiddish newspapers is, first of all, if a lot of people are reading, and if a lot of people are reading more than one newspaper. Besides scholarship and besides publishing, it's a great center of Jewish libraries and archives. This is in the foreground, the Strashun Library, the Jewish Community Library of Vilna, situated right next to the Great Synagogue. Great Synagogue dated back to the 1590s. So it's in the library, which is a much newer building, was intentionally built as an annex to the synagogue, almost to say that it's a kind of sacred space, the library. This library, on the community budget, is probably the greatest library under Jewish auspices in Europe. It had 5 Hebrew language incunabula, that is, books printed before the year 1500. There weren't a lot of Hebrew books printed before 1500, but this library had 5 of them, and it had hundreds of books printed in the 1500s. This library, in another important sort of symbolic statement, was open 7 days a week. It was even open on Shabbat, on Saturdays, on the Jewish Sabbath. You couldn't take notes in the reading room on Saturdays, but if you'd ordered a book on Friday, you could come in and read on Saturdays. And that was a statement that, reading is so integral to life that there's no day off from it. The library should be available and accessible all days of the week. Another great collection, another great institution in Vilna was this one, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, the predecessor to the institute that's now here in New York. It is a modern institution, really applied the methods of the social sciences and humanities to the Jewish experience and culture. It had a great archive, especially things like posters and flyers, ephemera, things that people threw away. It also had the records of Jewish communities, their minute books, and therefore it was great for the study of the modern Jewish experience. And you're seeing also a wide array of activities by YIVO, including courses for teachers and things like that. These are the 2 greatest repositories, but there were many more in Vilna. There was a Jewish museum. There are all kinds of institutions of higher education, Hebrew and Yiddish teachers, seminaries, synagogues, and private collections. I call Vilna, in my book, the city of the book. The people of the book had a city of the book, this Jerusalem of Lithuania. And besides all of that, it had, of course, writers, not only readers and publishers and scholars, but writers. And this is the literary group, Young Vilna. Storytellers, poets, some plastic artists. I was pointing out these 2 writers who will be central to our story. This person here on the right is Avram Sutzkever, whom most people consider the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. He was the grandson of a rabbi, but he himself is apolitical, not religious, but neither a Zionist nor a socialist. His only ideology, as he once said, was poetry. And next to him, his closest friend, Shmerke Kaczerginski, who's a remarkable biography. He was orphaned as a young child. He grew up in an orphanage and actually worked in a print shop. But he a lot self-taught and in all kinds of institutions, so that from an orphan, really indigent and with no one, pulled himself up by his bootstraps and became a poet and a writer. He was, before the war, a man of the left. He was a member of the underground Communist Party in Poland at that time. Now, all that was by background, so you know what Vilna represents as a city, as a community in Jewish history. Now I'm coming to the body of my talk and to the period in which it takes place, which is the period of the German occupation of Vilna. The Germans came to Vilna much later than they came to Warsaw. Poland was invaded September 1, 1939, but Vilna was in eastern Poland, and the Germans only arrived 2 years later in 1941. 39 to 41, most of the time, Vilna belonged to the Soviets. The Germans came late, but when they came, they moved swiftly and with typical efficiency. The Jewish population on the eve of the German invasion, June 22nd, 1941, was 70,000. By September 1941, the Jewish population was 40,000. And by December of 1941, the Jewish population of Vilna was 20,000. In half a year, more than half of the Jewish population of the city was murdered. In September, that is, some of those people were murdered before September, some after. In September of 41, the Vilna Ghetto was created, originally with 40,000 inmates, but a few months later dwindled down to 20,000 inmates. The Jews of Vilna were murdered not in Auschwitz or Treblinka, or those kinds of death camps did not yet exist in the second half of 1941. They were victims of what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. That is, they were simply taken to the outskirts of town and by the Germans and mowed down, Germans and their collaborators, and mowed down by machine gun into pits, into a ravine. The place outside of Vilna where this was done, the mass murder site, was known as Ponar in Yiddish, Ponari in Polish, Panirai in Lithuanian. In January 1942, the mass murder surprisingly stopped. There will be atrocities for the next several years, but nothing of a systematic or large scale like in those 6 months at the beginning. And instead, the inhabitants of the Vilna Ghetto entered what was known as the period of stability. And the ghetto is organized into work brigades where the inmates are slave laborers on behalf of the Germans. Most ghetto inmates leave the ghetto in the morning for their assigned workplace. Could be a factory, it could be the train station, it could be anywhere. And then they will come back at the end of their workday to the ghetto, where they will be, of course, body searched as they return, because they're not allowed to bring in food. And ghetto inmates want to bring in food to because the official rations in the ghetto are very, very meager. So life is a very difficult and grim routine, hoping against hope that perhaps the Red Army will turn things around and force the Germans out. The story that I'm telling you really is a story of this period of stability from January 1942 through the summer of 1943. In the summer of 1943, the Vilna Ghetto will be liquidated. All its inhabitants will be sent to various types of camps. All right, now to the core of the story. And I need to introduce you to this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the special detail of the Reich leader Rosenberg, Alfred Rosenberg, one of Hitler's senior lieutenants. This organization was named after him and led by him. This is Nazi Germany's agency for looting cultural treasures all across Europe. If you saw the movie La Monuments Men, or better yet, if you read the book Monuments Men, you know something about this, that the Nazis wanted to have the greatest museum on earth. The master race should have everything. It should have the greatest museum, the greatest library, the greatest academy, and therefore they looted most famously art, but also books, everywhere they conquered, from Paris to Kiev, and everywhere in between, north and south. What is less well known is that this organization had a department for looting Judaica, for looting books about Jewish subjects, books in Hebrew and in Yiddish, Jewish ritual art, Jewish documents, etc. It's very paradoxical because on the one hand, the Germans were already exterminating Jews, murdering them in the hundreds of thousands. On the other hand, they were looting, maybe we could say collecting, Jewish books and keeping them in specialized libraries and institutes in Germany. Why were they doing this? Because the Germans had a branch of scholarship, quote unquote scholarship, that's called Judenforschung, study of the Jews. The Nazis wanted to show that their anti-Semitism was not just some kind of whim or some kind of prejudice, but it was predicated on science, on scholarship. And therefore, they had specialized institutes and scholars who studied the Jews in order to prove in a scientific way that Jews were depraved, that Jews were a menace, that Jews were harm to society, and therefore the implication being that the Nazi solution, final solution to the Jewish question, was justified because science had shown it was necessary. This is Dr. Johannes Paul, who is the top Judaica expert for this organization, the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. Paul was originally a Catholic priest. He studied in Rome, he studied in Jerusalem, and he knew biblical Hebrew and he learned rabbinic Hebrew. He then threw away the priesthood, returned to Germany, became a devout Nazi, married, and applied his knowledge of Hebrew and of other Jewish subjects to this new field of Judenforschung. And he's the top bibliographer. And he is the top Judaica looter everywhere in Europe. And he knows, Paul knows, because of his special knowledge, that Vilna is a special place on the Jewish map, that it's got these great libraries and archives. And therefore, he comes to Vilna literally 2 weeks after the Wehrmacht, after the German army arrives in Vilna. He's there in July 1941, getting a lay of the land. The Strashun Library, the YIVO archive. But even Johannes Paul was stunned at the scope and magnitude of Jewish documentation and literature in this city. Now, he was faced with a dilemma because he couldn't send everything to Germany for Judenforschung. That's certainly not necessary. There are many libraries. He doesn't need to send 10 copies of the same book. And there must be some kind of sorting process in order to decide what is valuable and therefore should be sent to Germany, and what is not valuable and therefore should be just disposed of as trash. Who can do that? There aren't a lot of Johannes Pauls out there. And therefore, he came up with the idea of creating yet another slave labor brigade, a brigade of intellectuals who will sort the books and papers on behalf of the Germans and decide what is valuable will be sent to Germany, what is not valuable will be destroyed as trash. And he did create a quota that no more than 20% could be declared valuable. 80% will have to be disposed of as trash. This slave labor brigade became known colloquially among ghetto inmates as the paper brigade, because after all, what did they do? They just pushed paper all day. Yes, when books got to Germany, you can see here the stamp of a Hebrew book with a Nazi swastika on it, with the stamp of a place called the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. Who worked in this brigade? The head of the brigade was a professional librarian, a Jewish librarian from Warsaw, Hermann Kruk, who had fled Warsaw in 1939, only to be overtaken by the Germans in Vilna in 1941. Kruk was a socialist, a Bundist, but he really believed that the way to lift up the working class and the suffering masses is through education and is through reading. His deputy was a scholar from the Ivo Institute, Zelig Kalmanovich. Kalmanovich had 2 PhDs, one from a German university, one from a Russian university. He was a real polymath, knew everything. Someone once quipped, when Zelig Kalmanovich walks into the room, I don't need an encyclopedia. At this time, when the Germans arrived during the war, he is a Zionist. His son lives in the land of Israel, already then, before the war, and he is a believer. He's a religious man. Nonetheless, these 2 heads of the brigade worked together rather well, despite the fact that one's a socialist and the other is a Zionist. And there are many other, in all there were 40 people working in this brigade, 20 intellectuals and 20 technical workers. 2 more of the intellectuals are our 2 poets that we saw earlier in Jung Vilna. This is Shmerke Kachaginsky, the orphan and the communist. This is Avram Sutzkever, the grandson of the rabbi and the aesthete and poet, who are also working in this brigade. And in the middle is their good friend, Rachela Krinsky. She was a high school teacher of history. She had a master's degree from Vilna University. She knew Latin, she knew Old Polish, and she has a very special personal story. Her husband was murdered very early on, before the ghetto. That is, in July 1941, he was rounded up and shot at Ponar. They had a toddler, a daughter, 1.5 years old. And when the ghetto was created, Rachela decided that she's entering the ghetto alone. She's not taking her daughter inside. And she left her daughter with her nanny, Polish nanny, and said, you take her. And the nanny moved to a different part of town and raised that daughter, and Rachel would not see that daughter again. Her source of strength in the ghetto are her friends, the 2 poets, and also her love for poetry, which she found to be a great distraction and also a great solace in the ghetto. And the work is this long hours of sorting mountains upon mountains of material. This is for this group who are intellectuals, they were also artists and musicians, and of course, all kinds of educators and scholars. For this group, this is torture. They're all book lovers, and they're being forced to collaborate, participate in the destruction or looting and destruction of their own culture. And it gnaws at them. They can't live with themselves, that they're being used this way. And there's only one type of material that escapes that fate of either looting or destruction, to face, in a sense, maybe what we could call a worse fate. And that is Torah scrolls. Torah scrolls, the scrolls with the 5 books of Moses on them that are read in the synagogue every Saturday, considered the most holy item in the Jewish religion. But they're made of parchment, not out of paper. That's animal hide. And therefore the Germans did not burn it like trash, but they didn't need more than a few Torah scrolls. They used the parchment to repair Nazi army boots, soldiers' boots, as inserts to repair the boots. Maybe this picture tells it all, that the sense of the anger and fury and the sense of humiliation and degradation that these workers felt in the way their cultural heritage is being treated. So they had to come up with another way. They couldn't live with themselves, but to do something else. And that other way was to hide material. And the main way they thought to hide material, there were many ways, was to bring it back into the ghetto. To take it from their work site where they were doing this sorting, which was outside the ghetto, back in. Why back in? Because the ghetto is sort of Jewish territory. It will be among fellow Jews, and it will be nearby. They'll be able to see it, to check on it. They'll feel that it's safe if they can have access to it. But getting the material back in the ghetto means passing through guards and body searches. And just like someone could be literally sent to their death for smuggling in food, they could be sent to their death for smuggling in paper. The way they smuggled it in, again, is on their bodies, under their shirt, under their pants, sometimes like a diaper. In winter, of course, there are boots. Now, you can do the math with me, but if this brigade worked for 500 days and you had 20 people smuggling material and each took 3 items a day, that's, if I'm not mistaken, 30,000 items that you could smuggle. So a lot, but every single day was a great risk at the gate. Actually, Rachela was once caught, but she was very, very lucky. She was caught smuggling in a golden wine goblet used for the prayer over wine, for the blessing over wine, the Kiddush cup. And everyone was sure Rachela was going to go to her death. But there was a German at the gate, and she just simply turned around and said to him, "Oh, I brought this for you. It's a present. Take it. And I happen to have a nice pair of gloves, and they're for your wife." And she was just very fortunate that the German took that bribe, effectively bribe, and let her through. So there are many stories about what happened at the gate. But there were beatings, but nobody was killed this way. Once inside the ghetto, they actually had all kinds of hiding places, but the biggest was this book bunker on Chaville Street. It was, you entered through a manhole and all kinds of stairways. This bunker was used for crates of books and papers, but also, not only also, but primarily for arms. There was an underground resistance movement in the Vilna Ghetto, planning a great ghetto uprising. And when they got guns, they kept them, stored them here. So you had side by side, both the guns and the books, these kind of 2 forms of resistance, armed resistance and moral or spiritual resistance. And Sutzkever, even wrote a poem called Grains of Wheat about this experience, about carrying these Jewish words, right? So that the spirit won't be murdered by the hordes. And he feels this despair, but then he says, you know, I remember a story about Egypt, about a pharaoh that ordered that grains of wheat be buried next to his tomb in a pyramid. And then those grains of wheat were found 6,000 years later, 9,000 years later. That's what I'm doing. I'm not burying these materials, I'm planting them. And I believe it will be discovered someday and therefore will blossom. These words will nourish and belong to the people in its eternal walk. It was really very much an act of faith, what they were doing. There were also non-Jewish friends who helped. This is Anna Shemaita, an ethnic Lithuanian, who hid a great deal of material. How did that happen? Well, the Germans didn't guard this workplace with all the books and papers very tightly. They left for the lunch hour and they left the workers unattended. They weren't worried that anybody would escape because if one person escapes, the whole group will be executed. If the whole group escapes, then their whole families will be executed. And so nobody escaped, but they did have the facility to themselves during lunch hour, and non-Jewish friends, it's outside the ghetto, could come and visit them. And Ona Shemaita would do that, visit them and hid a great deal of material in her home. I'm going to move the story forward, though there's much more that could be said. Both of these poets belong to that underground resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. Because of that, there never was a great Vilna Ghetto uprising, and the members of this resistance organization fled the ghetto shortly before it was dissolved in September 1943. They fled to the forests where they met up with Soviet partisans. Many of the people who fled this way, who belonged to this resistance organization, fled through the sewage system. You entered a manhole and you simply crawled on all fours through the filth until you got far enough that you were out of the ghetto or even out of the city. They both survived, the poets. The others, the leads of this brigade, the socialist librarian, the religious and Zionist scholar, they both perished in camps in Estonia, the most prominent of which was in this place called Kluga. Rachela Krinsky, the high school teacher of history, she survived just barely. She was sent to a camp. With the liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto, was sent to a camp in Stutthof near Danzig. Stutthof was a labor camp turned death camp. It had a crematorium, and every day she saw bodies going up in smoke and expected to be next. She was just very lucky not to be killed at Stutthof. She survives, but she's a very broken woman. We have her letters that she writes after Stutthof was liberated, and she writes to the poets and just says, I really can't find any meaning to this life. Other people are falling in love. I can't even imagine falling in what love means after what I've been through. She has one healthy instinct, and that is to see her daughter again. She knows her daughter's with the nanny, and she writes in one of these letters, it's not that I can be of any help to my daughter. I'm sure the nanny's a great mother. What can I do for my daughter in my current state? But maybe my daughter can help me. Maybe I can find some kind of value in life if I can reunite with her. Okay, now, Vilna is liberated by the Soviets, by the Red Army in July 1944. Yes, the war will go on for almost another year in Europe, but Vilna is liberated in July 44. And it's a city, the Jewish part of the city is in ruins. Bombing and other causes. This is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon in ruins. This is the YIVO building bombed out in ruins. The poets go back. The poets who have survived, they've been partisans, go back. They go back not because they're looking for family or friends. They know all their family and friends have been murdered. They're not going back for property like they want an apartment or something. They're going back to finish the job, to find the books and papers that they hid. They're doing this for its own sake, and they're doing it also for the sake of their colleagues who were murdered. And they begin a retrieval operation. And here's Sutzkever on the left with two other colleagues, with a hand wagon collecting papers and artwork. Right? They find some fragments of Torah scrolls. They find art. How art was rescued is a whole other topic. Mountains of newspapers. And they create a Jewish museum in the newly Soviet city, now called not Vilna, but Vilnius. And actually the only place they could find for this museum was in what had inside the Vilna Ghetto, what had been the ghetto under the Nazis. It's a big territory with a lot of, blown out windows, but still with rooms and with a courtyard. And they start collecting material, cataloging material. Just one thing they didn't pay attention to initially, which is they are freed from the Nazis, but they are now in the Soviet Union. And the head of the Communist Party in Lithuania then is Mikhail Suslov, a close associate of Joseph Stalin. And Suslov is dead set against there being a Jewish museum in Vilna. Fortunately for them, it's not a high priority. He's got much bigger problems in establishing Soviet rule in Lithuania. But when it comes to his attention, he says no. Jews need to Russify, Jews need to Sovietize, Jews need to assimilate. So the writers, the poets realize that they're in a crisis again. They've rescued the material from the Nazis, but it's now in danger in the hands of the Soviets. They may take it away, they may destroy it, and indeed that's what happens. They had a lot of material out in the courtyard. You saw that enormous courtyard. And one night, garbage trucks came in the middle of the night and took away tons of Jewish books and papers as trash and disposed of it in the trash administration. That was the last straw from them. And they said, we must rescue this material again, get it out of the Soviet Union, which they did through various devices, mainly through taking it to neighboring Poland and from neighboring Poland elsewhere. This is just an example of a suitcase with a false bottom. So you could open it and you just see clothing, but you'd have to know that underneath the clothing there are papers. And it's a large operation to get as much as they could. Of course, they couldn't get most out, but they got a good deal of it out from Lithuania to Poland, where there, again, here are our two poets now in Poland. But Poland after the war was also not very hospitable to Jews. There was a famous pogrom in Poland in July 1946. And the poets move on. They'll go from Poland to France, where they'll divide, split up their ways. Sutzkever will go to Palestine, later Israel. And Shmerke Kaczerginski will stay in Paris and then go to Buenos Aires. They send material in two directions. They send it to New York, because in New York there is the reconstituted YIVO Institute, and they send it to Israel, Jerusalem. Rachel Krinsky did reunite with her daughter. She reunited with her daughter, Sarah, in Poland. The nanny brought the daughter from Soviet Lithuania to Poland. Rachela made her way from the Stutthof camp to Poland, and after a very difficult triangular relationship, because this girl did not know who this woman was. She just called her madam. The nanny she called mommy. It took months and months until she actually writes in a letter, she is my daughter again, and Rachela will move eventually to the United States, where she had a brother. The Jewish Museum was closed down. Of course, Suslov had his way. It was liquidated. All the materials were sent to various repositories. Most of the material was sent to this church, St. George's Church, a former church in Vilnius, Lithuania. Then it was a book repository. That's where it lay for 40 years, from 1949 till 1989, when I saw it in this church. In the waning years of the Soviet Union. The materials were hidden in the basement of this book repository and had been untouched in those 40 years. Now, I've talked about them rescuing books and papers. To wrap things up, I just want to show you examples of what they rescued. A diary by Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. This is a diary from before he was the father of modern Zionism in the 1880s. The record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Ghetto. That synagogue was destroyed, we saw that, but its minute book, which spans more than 150 years of meetings of the board, was saved. All kinds of little Yiddish books, like prayers for childbirth, what a woman will say when she prays, letters by the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, a bust of Leon Tolstoy, sculpted by a Jewish poet, a Jewish sculptor from Vilna, and material from the ghetto itself. So you have here a concert program of the symphony orchestra of the Vilna Ghetto, or a call to armed resistance from the resistance organization, the FPO, in the ghetto. So it's a rich panoply of material that they were able to get at, to rescue, which is today divided between New York, Jerusalem, and Vilnius, Lithuania. Sutzkever settled in Israel, had a very distinguished career as a Yiddish poet, an editor. He had, among his writers were many of the founders of Israel. Golda Meir knew Yiddish well and read his poetry, as did other leaders of Israel. The other poet, Shmerke Kaczerginsky, settled in Buenos Aires, headed a Jewish culture organization there. And when he took the helm of that organization, said, I know what devotion to culture means. Me and my colleagues in the paper brigade, we showed devotion to culture, and I promise you that same level of devotion in my new position. Rachela Krinsky remarried a fellow survivor of the Vilna Ghetto, Abraham Melezin, and she raised her daughter, and her granddaughter, Alex Wall, lives in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, in California today. So this is an amazing story of people who really risked their lives and were willing to pay with their lives for the sake of culture, for the sake of books, manuscripts, art. I think what they made was a real existential choice, which is if they wanted to, they were sure they were going to be killed, and they wanted to spend the remaining time doing something valuable, spending their remaining life. And if they were going to be killed, they wanted to be killed for smuggling a rare book, not for smuggling a potato. And they're heroes. They are heroes in, I think, the definition of a hero is someone that is willing to risk their life for something noble that is larger than them, then not only military heroes are heroes. And these are also people who did exactly that. So it's a story that should inspire all of us who are committed to learning, to knowledge, to reading, to culture, and to say, no matter what the challenges are, we can always remain committed to those values. If they could do it in the Vilna Ghetto, we can do it at all times. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, I'd love to respond to them.
Wonderful. Thank you for a really stimulating, beautifully crafted lecture, Professor Fishman. We do have some questions that are bubbling up, and before I mention those, I want to take a moment to thank the many co-sponsors that collaborated in order to make this event happen, and those include the Departments of Religion, of History, German Studies, Russia and East Asian Studies, Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, as well as the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Hightower Fund, the Center for Ethics, and the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life here at Emory. It's wonderful to have representatives and stakeholders from all of those that I know are in the audience with us. So now let us turn to some of these questions, and if audience members have further questions, please feel welcome to put them into the Q&A. So we have a question from Maria Rubin about how Shmerke Kaczyginski ended up in Buenos Aires. Did any of the works end up in Buenos Aires with him?
No. He didn't know himself that he'd end up in Buenos Aires. He stayed in Paris for many years. And so he sent whatever he had to New York, to the reconstituted YIVO Institute in New York.
And Mariana Kaufman asks about what has happened to the books at St. George's Church. And I would just piggyback onto that question and ask whether the books from this archive are distinct at YIVO, or are they integrated into the rest of the collections?
Okay. Well, I mean, what was the questioner's question?
What happened to the books that were in the St. George's Church?
Let me start with that. Well, they have since been transferred to the Lithuanian National Library and have been in the possession of the Lithuanian National Library, for more than a decade now. So they're in good care and they're being digitized. But the books, and even more importantly, the papers and manuscripts, so that they'll be available online to researchers of all kinds everywhere. As far as what the material that went to YIVO, the documents were kept as a separate collection in the YIVO archives that was named the Sutzkever Kaczyginski collection. The books, on the other hand, were integrated and are scattered all throughout are cataloged as items in the YIVO library.
Our colleague David Blumenthal asks, do we know what criteria they used when saving material?
First of all, David Blumenthal, great to hear from you. I remember you from many years ago. What's interesting, the criteria, of rescuing material, these are spur of the moment decisions when a German isn't watching over your shoulder. Everyone made, I think the easiest decision was what not to rescue. In other words, if it was the second, third, fourth, fifth copy of a book, you didn't rescue it. You rescued one copy of a book. So there were some very simple, there are also pragmatic things, like it's easier to rescue something small than something big. It's a bigger project, how to rescue a large item that you can't fit under your clothing. The main thing, though, to say is there were no political or ideological considerations in what to rescue. Shmerke Kaczerginski, who was, after all, a communist before the war, risked his life to save religious literature, though you couldn't find someone more secular than Shmerke Kaczerginski. So I think there was a sense that just like all Jews are in peril, similarly, all Jewish cultural heritage is imperiled, and there shouldn't be, distinctions made in a time like this.
Our graduate student, Chava Green, asks, who did the materials belong to when they were discovered, and how were they taken out of Vilnius in the 80s? Was there any difficulty with that process of removal?
Well, let me be clear. The material that was discovered in the 80s was not removed from Lithuania. It remains in Lithuania till this day. And that's why it's in the Lithuanian National Library. I don't remember what the first half of the question is. Who did it belong to after the war? Right after the war, it belonged to this Jewish museum in Vilna until it was dissolved.
Okay, Richard Robertson asks, was Abba Kovner involved in the efforts of the Paper Brigade, and did they work directly with the FPO?
Right, the FPO being the armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. Abba Kovner was not directly involved in the Paper Brigade, meaning he didn't work there, although actually his younger brother, Michal Kovner, worked in the Paper Brigade. His brother perished. But there was a kind of symbiotic relationship of cooperation between the Paper Brigade and the FPO. And that's most easily visible in that picture of that bunker. In other words, the FPO built that bunker for its arms, but they also extended use of that bunker to the Paper Brigade to rescue books and papers. So the two supported each other and worked together. If I can add one other, because this is actually a very important kind of question, because it's about the relationship between armed resistance and spiritual or moral resistance. When the FBO wanted to make grenades and didn't know how to make a Molotov cocktail or a grenade, it had to find a manual that would teach them that. And lo and behold, they found that book and manual among the many libraries that were sent to this work site. In other words, the Paper Brigade, because I should explain, this work site also had non-Jewish books and papers, Russian especially. The Nazis were very fascinated with communism and with the Soviet Union, so they sent in Russian libraries too. And it was the Paper Brigade that found a munitions manual in Russian on how to make Molotov cocktails and grenades. So, and they forwarded that to the FPO. So there was a real symbiosis between the armed resistance and the cultural resistance in the ghetto.
I'll just pause here with the questions to say that a number of people are asking about the recording of this event. It will be uploaded to YouTube and available in a few days. And you can also check back with the TAM Institute website to see a link to that recording. Meanwhile, there are a lot more questions. It was a very generative talk. So Cheryl K asks, do you have any more details on how people actually got through the gates with these items? And I remember a very dramatic passage about a near miss, and maybe you would recount that to us.
There are many dramatic stories of very close calls at the ghetto gate. I'm not well, I can tell them all night. I begin the book with the story of Shmerke Kaczerginski, full of papers and books under his body. And there's a long line at the gate because a major German official, a high-ranking German, is at the gate and is personally inspecting the inmates. And everybody is dropping their potatoes and food on the floor, but Shmerke doesn't drop what he's got under his body. Everyone's assuming that he's smuggling food, but he's actually smuggling books. And he's getting very worried because people are getting beaten. If you can hear the screams. And luckily, this high-ranking German officer got tired of doing body searches and left. And as soon as he left, everybody sort of rushed into the ghetto past the other guards, and Schmecker got in scot-free. And other people yelled, oh, he's so, everybody said, you know, some people have all the luck. He has all the luck. They didn't realize that what he's got is not food, but he's got books. So there's there are many close calls at the gate. Let me just say, since this was the question, it's a little more complex than that because the FPO, the armed resistance, had its own people among Jewish guards at the gate. There was the Jewish ghetto police, and there were FPO people who, moles, if you want, FPO moles at the gate as guards. So if you were lucky and you got that person as the guard searching your body, you were home scot-free, no problem. But you couldn't be sure when you got to the gate who was going to body search you. Was it going to be a Jewish ghetto police, maybe an FPO mole, or would it be a German or a Lithuanian? So it was a risk. Even under the best of circumstances, it was a risk.
So a number of our listeners have asked about the books that were sent to Germany that came into Nazi hands, and what was the ultimate disposition of those books?
Right. I never include that in my talk. And then I want to see if anyone is really listening. And then I know it's a good audience if people ask that question. So you pass. The material that was sent to Germany ended up in Frankfurt. As you saw, where there was that Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. This happened to be very important because Frankfurt was in the American zone of occupied Germany, not the Soviet zone, not the British zone, but the American zone. And the Americans struggled what to do with that material. Not only the Vilna material, but a lot of other looted Jewish books from all of Europe. In the end, the Americans decided that this reconstituted YIVO Institute in New York was the legal heir, or actually the exact continuation of the YIVO in Vilna, and that whatever was from Vilna would be sent to this institute in New York. So it's very paradoxical that what was sent to Germany actually was sent by the Americans to New York. And that was sort of a happy ending. But what remained in Vilnius was inaccessible to anybody for more than 40 years. Of course, the members of the Paper Brigade couldn't have known that everything that would be sent to Germany would be discovered by the Americans and sent to New York.
And what is the attitude of the National Library in Lithuania about the diffusion of those documents or granting access to them now?
No, I think that the attitude of the National Library of Lithuania is very fine. In other words, the material is cared for, it's safe, they've got professional staff that know the languages. I think in a sense, I think what I've seen as far as the library administration, they're proud to have this material and proud to show it to visitors. So that on that level, you know, it's satisfactory. I have to add, though, I believe on a moral level, the material should have been returned to some kind of Jewish body, either YIVO in New York or the National Library of Israel. You know, Jews risk their lives for this. And I think the material should have been, this is my personal opinion, reunited with the people from whom it was stolen, and with the people who rescued it. But that's my personal opinion. That's not what happened. And so it is not where the Jews are. It's not in New York, and it's not in Israel. It's in Lithuania. But on a scholarly level, it is being taken care of well.